A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Retrofit Academy Retrofit for Social Housing Summit. It's brilliant to have currently 160 of you here. I rather suspect there are many others still trying to join. But it's great. It's a great sign of progress and a great sign of the amount of activity that is going on in this sector at the moment. And it's not before time, is it? Let's face it, because as we're going to hear about in our first couple of presentations today, we've been trying to make retrofit move in social housing for a long, long time now. Wind the clock back 10 years, and we're all very excited about the end of a major R&D program called Retrofit for the Future, which was to herald the age of deep retrofit in social housing. But 10 years further on, are we really any further on or not? And that's really the subject of our first couple of conversations from presentations from two people who've been there and got the t-shirt. The first of those speakers is Emily Graham, who many of you will know through from Nottingham City Homes and Energy Strong, and then from Peter Rickaby, our technical director. Now, before I introduce the rest of the panel, I'd like to just talk to you, particularly those of you who are social landlords or local authorities, about some new support that is available from the Retrofit Academy, specifically for the social housing sector, and indeed those of you who service it. We are constantly approached by social landlords and local authorities saying that they want to find the services of a retrofit coordinator who's qualified and accredited. And frankly, we do our absolute level best to make as many introductions as we possibly can. But it's time that we had a better system in place for making that happen. I'm very grateful that thanks to some support from the Department for Business, we're now able to offer a free matchmaking service between social landlords, local authorities, and retrofit coordinators. And we'll be starting that through the service called Retrobook, which is now a wholly owned Retrofit Academy product. It's free for all users. It's very much a centre of excellence product, and any social landlord requiring the services of coordinators can post those opportunities on that site immediately, or indeed come to us and we'll talk you through it. We also have 20 fully funded places on the Level 5 Retrofit Coordinator course. We have a programme starting at the beginning of May, and there's a link there for anybody who is intending to act as the retrofit coordinator on social housing demonstration fund projects or local authority delivery fund projects. So application window is open as of now, and we really encourage you to apply. You don't have to work for a social landlord in order to apply for that, but if you are in a private sector, you do already have to have a contract or have it agreed with your client that you will be providing the coordinator service on those schemes. So a really good opportunity there. Now, we're also publishing today our Retrofit Academy Social Housing Toolkit. We're making some of that available to everybody to download, and the remainder of it is being made available to Centre of Excellence members, which includes many of you who are on this call today. And after this session, Andy Johnson there, who's probably just had the most stressful 15 minutes of his career with us so far, is going to be in contact with you to let you know how you can get hold of that toolkit. It will be in the knowledge base for Centre of Excellence members. And indeed, Andy is very much, he's the Centre of Excellence manager, so sort of your best friend moving forwards and helping out with everything that's Centre of Excellence related. Still admitting a few people in here, forgive me as I'm a bit distracted. So the Social Housing Toolkit covers all that stuff, and it was written by Dr. Peter Rickaby, who you're going to be hearing from this morning, along with Sally Hancox, who did the chapter on engaging and motivating residents, and I even chipped in here and there too, but it's largely Peter's work. And it is, for those of you who are developing retrofit strategy, which is many of you, this is an absolutely fantastic place to start. So we do lots of work with housing associations looking at housing stock assessment and evaluation. This is literally the textbook that will tell you how to do that in the context of deep retrofit and moving away from measures-based retrofit. So really proud to unveil that, and I have to say we put it hot off the press this morning, and it really does look great. So we're very excited about that. Okay, so as I say, social housing and retrofit, it's not new. We've been trying to do energy efficiency upgrades forever. Some of us, including Emily, we're going to hear from in a minute, have been at Peak Retrofit and Energy Strong now for what, 5-6 years. And of course, we had Retrofit for the Future and the Green Home Grant Social Housing Fund launched last year. So there's been lots going on, but we haven't quite cracked it yet, have we? And we're going to have to do that. Is the social housing sector going to be the test bed for Retrofit, where we get supply chain and demand side collaborating and cooperating, or is it forever going to be the forgotten sector? Is it going to be the sector where innovative approaches are pioneered at scale and proven, or is it where Retrofit will simply go stale? So without further ado, I shall introduce the speakers who are going to talk us through that. So Emily Braham, many of you will know. If you don't, you certainly need to. Emily has for several years now, I can't remember exactly how long, but for quite a while, been head of energy projects at Nottingham City Homes. She is, I believe, about to join Energy Strong full-time, and I'm sure she'll be talking to you about that. But what I've asked Emily to do today is tell her really what her top 10 lessons as a social landlord have been over the last few years. So very valuable insight there. We're then going to hear from Peter Rickaby, who is going to look back at that Retrofit for the Future programme and remind us really what we learned from it and whether we're putting those lessons into proper effect. It's remarkable how short the corporate memory is sometimes, and there were lots of fantastic learnings from that programme. Kate Duffy from Bays is going to talk to us about the local authority delivery scheme. So this isn't a social housing scheme as such, but it's the first major scheme involving local authorities in Retrofit in this country for quite a significant period of time. So you're going to be talking about that, and also the future direction of fuel poverty policy, which Kate is one of the leads on. We're then going to have two presentations from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, or the social housing team within Bays. So Adam Matthias is going to talk to us about the Whole House Retrofit competition, which was launched a couple of years ago and funded several projects to start delivering large-scale retrofit programs, sort of from memory, 100 units plus. There's been lots of issues with COVID and stuff getting in the way of that program, but we're going to find out what's been learned so far and how that's going. And then we're going to hear from Mike Martin on the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is initially a sort of innovation program, but it's going to scale up very significantly, and the hope is that will become a multi-billion-pound program over the next few years. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Emily to share her screen. I very much hope you're there, Emily. You could unmute yourself.
I'm here. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so relieved.
Hi.
Thank you. I will unshare and allow you to share yours.
I will try and do that now then. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much.
Right. Tell me if you can see this.
Yeah, that's great, Emily. If you just want to go full screen on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David, for asking me to speak today. And hello, everybody. I'm Emily Braham, as David has so kindly introduced. I'm currently Head of Sustainable Energy for Nottingham City Homes, which is a role I've been doing for 8 years now. Over the last couple of years, I've also been doing a day a week. So I've reduced my hours there. I've been doing a day a week with Energy Strong UK, and really looking at how we can try and take some of the lessons that we've learned from Nottingham City Homes more collectively to help really move the agenda forward. Today I wanted to focus on the lessons from the projects over the last 8 years that I've done at Nottingham. We've done some really exciting projects. So before I started, Nottingham had done a large-scale solar PV rollout. There are about 4,000 homes with solar PV. 1,500 were done in a really short time frame, I think 3 months before the FIT tariff dropped. When I joined, it was just at the start of eco-funding, and we started with a project in the largest neighbourhood, council housing neighbourhood in Europe, or it claimed to be, in Clifton, which had 4,000 wimpy no fines. And we did a cross-tenure solid wall insulation project there using different pots of funding to make that work. The image at the top is Bentinck, Manders and Kingston, which was our 3 tower blocks that we insulated fully, and we did a sort of whole house retrofit, brought budgets together, and also rolled out the district heating from Nottingham at the same time. And then the bottom two are more recent projects. So the bottom one on the left is quite an iconic picture. A lot of people will probably have seen that. That's our Energy Sprung pilot, the first one in the UK. That one has communal energy, communal electricity through private wire, solar panels, as you can see, battery storage, and a ground source communal heating loop. And the one on the bottom right is our project called The Courts. That was also part of a European funded project through Horizon 2020, a remote urban project. And it also has a private wire battery storage, but that one is using the returns of the high temperature district heating that heats these tower blocks at the top to provide low temperature district heating for the tenants and leaseholders in that block. We're currently we've done 150 whole house retrofits, and we've got a further 400 that are underway, including blending different project funding from the local authority delivery so that we can actually do a cross tenure deep retrofit as well. So the next year, 18 months looks really exciting for NCH. Energy Sprung UK is a partner in those projects as well. So whilst I'll be moving out into Energy Sprung, I will still have some involvement in those projects. I think the biggest challenge for me today in doing this was to try and find 10 lessons, because I actually did a master's by research on the project, the big cross tenure project. So I had a quick look at that recently to remind myself, and there are so many lessons that over the last 8 years I've learned. I've tried to pick the most important ones. And the ones that I think have sort of continued to evolve as the projects have progressed. It might be a bit of a whistle-stop tour in just 15 minutes, but I think we've got a chance to discuss afterwards as well. I think that the starting point is to prepare well. So the first lesson is to think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. In Nottingham, we did a fuel poverty index, and we looked at our worst performing homes, and we looked at the deliverability of them as projects. We put them together as schemes. We looked at the SAP, and then we looked at the fuel poverty indicators, and we got buy-in from the organisation to this sort of route around the city for the projects that we would do. Construction projects are complicated, and construction projects to occupied homes are even more complicated. When you start to add in the complexity of retrofit policy, technical issues, retrofit funding, which is a bit stop-start, or has been a bit stop-start, although the current projects are very encouraging, and the signs of the future funding is encouraging. It's about, you sort of have to put together these schemes that have got these variable inputs that you have no control over, fixed parameters that you also have no control over, but you really need to understand both of those in order to then make your choices about the project. And you also need to bring everybody with you. So you need to ensure that your finance team and your procurement team and your legal team have all had an opportunity to influence some of those scheme decisions. And that allows the decision makers then to be able to understand the risks from their perspective in order that they can approve the scheme, and in order that they feel like they've got an ownership of it. Some of these lessons have come from delays at the start of projects where you've structured a project and you bid for funding and you're just about to go off and procure people, and you find that actually you haven't brought the organisation with you. And there's a harder job then to try and get them to catch up. The next lesson is about archetyping, and I think archetyping is really important, and I think it's just important for us to understand the levels at which we archetype and the purposes for archetyping. So a Wimpy No finds, as an example, as an archetype. These are properties that there were 300,000 of them built after the war as part of the EMF programme, the Emergency Manufacturing Programme, and it continued. If you think about them as an archetype and the fact that they're concrete and they need insulating on the walls, that's a good archetype to get some consistency for technical solutions. And it's really good for scale up. And it's important, I think, as we do that scale up, to start categorising properties and coming up with the technical solutions that can be rolled out for those, starting to look at how we can reduce cost. However, when you come to planning the detail of a project, and particularly planning budgets to try and get approval to a project, you start to look at the data that you've got in-house as a housing provider, and your archetype is slightly different there. So your archetype will be a 3-bedroom, semi-detached or an end terrace property. So the Clifton project, these images have been taken from, and all of these properties were classified as the same in our data. And it was only when we went out and started looking at them and surveying them that we realised that the cost implications of delivering just a single measure scheme to these properties were really significant when you started to scale it up over a project. So 31% variation due to the wall area, due to the type of roof and the fact that on some properties you needed to extend verges and on others you didn't. Scaffold lifts are different. And you establish a budget per property. You don't establish it for metre squared area in terms of how you gain approval to your internal budgets and your match funding. So I think it's really important to understand what the exercise is about and what purpose it's for. Energy modelling is another reason for archetyping, but you need slightly different understanding of what the archetypes are, or you can group them slightly differently for energy modelling. Put this one in because I think there's quite a lot of interesting stuff to learn about party walls, and it isn't just about whether you need to get a party wall notice or not, although there is some difference between different organisations and the way that they consider that. As social housing organisations, we have to deal with party walls and we have to deal with owner occupiers or private landlords, and also we have to deal with people refusing at the moment, and so you're going to have to deal with party wall. There are technical challenges around that, and the images that I've shown there are from the Clifton project, and they show that the boundaries internally and externally aren't aligned. So you don't have the legal right to actually be able to insulate to where you need to avoid internal technical challenges like the one shown on the internal photo there. The other issue with party walls, and this is one that we're experiencing on our Energy Sprung project, is the additional cost of dealing with those junctions. So you've got to work out how to make the eaves work, even though you're not doing one property and there's a gap. You've got to work out how to make the roof junctions work, and then also the returns on the walls. And I think it's probably worth me just moving on to this one to show the image of the bottom right, which is the Energy Sprung project. And it shows that the form of those properties it's got very narrow fronts. So the wall area that's actually insulated with the project is smaller than the wall area that's a party wall. So one of the other issues that we're experiencing at the moment is that we're losing quite a lot of heat. So tenants in these homes where we've guaranteed the energy performance are losing heat into their adjacent neighbour's property because they're not heating their home. And we've got homes that are using no heat, but they're remaining at 18 degrees inside with 6 degrees outside, and their neighbour is spending lots of money on their heating. And that's because there is such a huge loss through the party walls, particularly because of those types of property. Cross tenure is a solution to that. So delivering cross tenure and considering delivering cross tenure is one of the other lessons. And we've done, as I've said, we've done a big cross tenure project. We had one of the Green Deal communities funding schemes, and we also had eco funding for private residents. Social housing provides a really good base that you can use to market to get private sector uptake, but it does mean it's more complex and you have to blend different schemes. It adds complexity. You've got to really think about the programme impacts of including private sector, because you have a different engagement process. You've got to have marketing and assessments. You've also got to be really clear about exactly what's included and not included, because there's a higher variation in the work that's been done to private homes in advance. But there are really big neighbourhood benefits as well as the party wall benefits. You've got the benefits of the improved regeneration. And particularly when you work for a local authority housing provider, the councillors are very keen that schemes are delivered cross tenure. Delivering cross tenure, though, also adds to the logistics and the programming and the planning requirements. And I've put essential in there in bold because it really is important. So absolutely essential to have the capability to do really effective programming and logistics management for any kind of construction project, but even more so in occupied homes, even more so when you start delivering at scale or cross tenure, or you start to do whole house. It isn't just the sequencing of the measures. You've got to consider refusals and access issues. You've got to consider disrepair issues that you might find when you get to those properties, or you might just find them at survey. You might uncover them when you start to do some work actually on the property to improve them. With our current project, one of our current projects funded by the Whole House Retrofit project, one of the work streams is Destination Zero, and we're carrying that on onto the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. And one of the aims with that project is to look at how we could get to our 2050 standards in more than one leap. So Energy Sprung is one leap. Destination Zero is looking at whether we could do that in 2 or 3 steps. And that's a slightly different sort of planning and programming management piece of work. We will be looking forward to sharing how that project progresses looking at things like doing the walls and the fabric in one go, and then doing the heating at the time that the boiler is required. But that requires you to think about issues like your gas meters having to stay in temporarily and then being taken out at a later date when you might put a heat pump, and designing the scheme so that you can put your heat pump in the place where the gas flue is at a later date. This one I'm not going to go into in detail because I'm sure that Peter will be touching on this one a bit, but modelled performance is not the same as actual performance. And the image there is showing the energy sprung bungalows when we took the roof off, and that was a project that had already had a loft insulation programme previously. So past 2035 will definitely help this, but there is a need to make sure that you're really carrying out those checks at design stage and understanding what the measures are that are going in. Innovation, that's one of my other learnings. So we started off doing projects that are a bit like the image here, and you had 3 people using effectively a ruler to draw brick patterns on a red render system, and that's still happening. And that's a kind of tried and trusted method of doing some brick effect render. Over the last few years, as David's mentioned, we've been really focusing on the sort of innovation and the whole house retrofits. And the image in the middle is one of our energy sprung wall panels flying in for one of the first pilot projects. But where we think we need to get to is an industry that works in a more similar way to a production industry, a more efficient and more effective industry, a bit like the automotive industry. And that's needed to rapidly scale up retrofit. Our current approaches and historic approaches have had really kind of slow timeframes and high labour costs. And we're starting to make progress in new build, but I think this is the image that I would say sums it up for me, is this is where we're at still in terms of the offsite manufacture for retrofit. My 8th lesson is about procurement, and I think this is a bit linked to the last slide and the last lesson, where we went out when we procured the Energy Sprung project because we wanted to procure an outcome, an off-the-shelf product that had a 30-year performance guarantee. And actually what we hadn't recognised fully, and our expectations weren't quite right, because we weren't procuring that. We were procuring a partner who would develop that. That didn't exist. There wasn't a product that existed for those properties that we could just go out and buy. So had we thought about that differently, we would have structured the procurement in a slightly different way. The other point about procurement is that historically, and particularly in new build, but also in retrofit, we have, as housing providers, focused on procuring the lowest upfront cost. And sometimes that comes at a cost, which is a quality cost, or it comes at a whole life cost. And I think that's another point where we really need to think about what it is that we want. So for a landlord, is the whole life cost more important? I think it is, but we then need the business model that sits behind that. The innovation partnership approach is one of the things that we're doing with Energy Sprung, which is addressing some of this, some of the issue with sort of stop-start procurement and the issue of trying to procure something that doesn't yet exist. And that's a staged approach, which we are using through the whole house retrofit. So our other work stream for Nottingham City Homes through the whole house retrofit is going through the innovation partnership. And we're really excited at the moment because that's underway. And the stages in that include a design stage and then a prototyping stage where a few properties are shown, the solution providers evidence the performance on a few properties and evidence how they're going to do it and test it. And then they move on to a pilot stage, and then they move on to a scale up. And as long as they go all the way through that, they get onto a £10 billion framework. So we think that that addresses some of those issues around trying to procure something that doesn't exist. And it also allows an opportunity for collaboration between the supply chain and the housing providers, which you mentioned again earlier, David. Costs and business models. I think at the moment, grant is really needed. But wouldn't it be better for us to have a self-financing business model for retrofit so that we could consistently deliver over a period of time, and we didn't have this complexity of trying to match the project to the funding streams? There are lots of different ways, things that come into this, but actually having a way of generating additional income and addressing the split incentive with tenants is really important. So Green Deal and Pay As You Save is a great concept, but there were issues with it. And so working with Energy Strong UK recently, we've been looking at the comfort plan, and that's something that we'll continue to develop as a methodology of having a way of addressing that split incentive. The other thing I wanted to raise on this one is that business cases at the moment require match funding from current planned budgets. And because of that, it means that you focus on the ones with the highest budgets, which are often the worst performing homes and the ones that have the most work to do. So it's really important to think at the start of a project about what those additional enabling works are going to be. So we've got lintel replacements, wall ties, fire safety works that might need to be done. What are the disrepair issues that we might find? On our Destination Zero project, we've got floors that have got really high moisture content, so we've not been able to insulate them yet. So we've got to pause that work, dry it out, do some remedial works, and then come back and insulate it. So contingency is absolutely essential. That one's in bold and in capital letters because it's so important. And the other thing to say is that we need to understand how to report on budgets and how to report on progress against budgets and potential overspends. And then the final one, last but definitely not least, is about tenants being on board. This is really important, particularly if we're starting to address the split incentive and charging the tenants for some of their energy savings. We need to think about how we engage them and how we engage them early and clearly. Some of the successes that we've had have been when we've asked tenants what it's like to live in their home, and we've tried to address some of the issues that they have that are not project related through the project. So for example, where we did the first Energy Strong project, tenants didn't have a doorbell and they live on the first floor. So putting a doorbell in was really small and really cheap, but actually it changed the way that they could live in their homes. We also asked them how to engage. So we've got a community champion who told us, this is where you should have your consultation events. Let's start with a fish and chip supper. You can do it in my house and I'll make sure everybody attends. And actually getting somebody who's a champion to help bring the others on board is really important. A dedicated liaison officer is essential, and they should visit the property every day. These works are really disruptive and you just want people to stay on board. There's also a financial risk if you don't have that happen, because if the tenant refuses access one day, particularly when you've got road closures and you've got crane hire, that's really expensive for somebody. The other thing that we found on this project particularly is that we didn't consider all of the requirements at the outset. So gas meter removal, do the tenants have debts? We need to think about that from day one, and we need to ask them that and work out how we're going to deal with it. We need to work out if we need approval to remove their gas meters. We want them to sign up to that at the start. Final couple of points from me is that, as I've mentioned, we're often starting with the worst properties, which means we're starting from a low point with our tenants. We've got people that we're finding who've had ongoing frustrations, and they've been told that they're not having their roof fixed because at some point in the future they're going to have a retrofit project. So we start a project with them already thinking that our project is a problem that has caused them a problem. So that's a challenge to be tackled and to be expected, I think. And then the last one is behaviour change and keeping the solution simple. So whilst we're getting more innovative and our technology is getting more complex, we have to find a way to make that simple for tenants and to help them and continue to live in their homes in a way that they want to. That is it from me. Hopefully I didn't go on too long. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so I will stop sharing.
You did extremely well, Emily, and thank you so much for doing that. My question is, how do we clone you? Because I think we need about 300 Emily Brahams at the minute. It must have been a fascinating journey, and I know how much you've put into it at Nottingham City Home. So congratulations to everything you've achieved. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to just put to you. Stephen Gerard asked whether the residents were decanted for the deep retrofit whole house project. I suspect that's the Energy Strong one. And if so, how were the costs covered for private households?
So we didn't decant the residents, we left them in situ for all of the projects, with the exception of some of our previous projects, not in the Energy Strong one, but there have been residents who are particularly vulnerable or having particularly challenging times in their lives. And one of the things that Nottingham City Homes builds into their tenders and their contract requirements is it's a programme, I suppose, called Helping Hands. And the contractors are asked to help residents who are vulnerable, empty lofts, for example. On this particular project, Newark Crescent, we had a resident who had a brain tumour and couldn't be in the property while the solution provider was doing drilling, and it was Sustainable Building Services, and they actually funded the tenant and his wife going away for a weekend, because that meant that they could carry out the works that were really intrusive at that point rapidly, and then the people could move back in and not be disrupted. We have had some challenges with leaseholders. So one of the projects that I showed at the beginning, the courts, that had 12 leaseholders in, and we had a couple of really challenging leaseholders in there. And they were offered an opportunity to move out. And on that one, Nottingham City Homes decided that actually to make the project work, because it was flats and we really needed to be able to deliver the work consistently, it would be better to fund a void for these leaseholders to live in. But they refused the opportunity, and it made life really difficult. So on that one, I wish that we had managed to get them to move out temporarily.
Yeah, okay.
In occupied homes is a real challenge, but necessary. Sorry, David.
No, not at all. Thank you. Just one more quick question and we'll move on to the next speaker. Adam Pope asks, did you find an increased risk of liability from damp claims to party walls from the untreated side? I think you might be muted, Emily.
Sorry, it's not something I'm aware of. I think there have been some issues with damp in some of our original retrofitted properties where we were just doing one measure, and we did do ventilation, but it was assumed that trickle vents and extract vents would be sufficient, and this was way back when. So I think there's been, in our tenanted properties, there have been some incidences of damp that we've had to return to, and it's one of the reasons that's taken us in the direction of looking at these performance guaranteed homes. Yep. And the comfort.
Okay, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I can't resist it. So of your 10 lessons and all of the bullet points that you covered within them, what's the one thing that you would encourage other social landlords to really take on board?
Oh, that's really put me on the spot. Hard enough to get to 10, which is the most important.
Have to think about it.
The tenants probably, because it doesn't work if they're not on board.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, great stuff. Thank you so much, Emily. That's brilliant. We'll come back to you in the panel discussion later on. I'd like to invite Peter Rickaby now, who's going to talk to us about what we learned 10 years ago and whether we've put it into practice effectively or not. So, Peter, like to unmute yourself.
I am unmuted. Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you fine.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my screen, which needs to be that one. Can you see that? Now you're muted, David, so I can't hear you.
Yes, we can, yes.
All right, okay, great. Good, all right. So David asked me to talk about, well, he asked me a quite challenging question, actually, which was, have we properly used what we learned from Retrofit the Future, or have we forgotten it all? And made me think about it. And the answer is, I think we have used it. So I thought I'd tell the story in this little slot about how we've used the lessons from Retrofit the Future. So let me just move us on. The story I want to tell you starts with Retrofit the Future, and that leads to our understanding of the retrofit process and the risks involved. And then I'm going to have a little sidetrack into retrofit failures, because I think they illustrate what happens when you don't learn the lessons, and then come back to how we have assimilated the lessons from Retrofit the Future and from lots of other places, from scaling up retrofit and whole house retrofit and all sorts of programs into the quality assurance scheme we've now got, which is by no means perfect, but does embody many of the lessons of the last 10 years. So it's a story in 4 chapters, really. So we start with Retrofit for the Future. Some of you from housing organizations may well remember Retrofit for the Future, and you probably remember it as a rather expensive disaster from which the housing associations didn't learn very much. And I think that's probably true, because it was certainly expensive, but there are other people who learned a lot, and they were mostly the consultants that the housing associations employed. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was a £17 million Technology Strategy Board programme, TSB are now Innovate UK, to pilot deep retrofit for housing associations and for houses only, no flats. It was a competition, and eventually 86 projects were funded involving 115 houses, each mostly with a separate housing association, and each housing association put together its own team, usually not from in-house people or from its usual consultants and contractors, but from local specialists who had some retrofit experience or at least claimed it. And the program imposed a target of energy performance in the form of a maximum of 17 kilograms of carbon dioxide per square meter per year. And that's close to a passive house kind of standard. Typically, these houses, before they were improved, would probably be making between 60 and 70 kilograms of CO2 per square meter per year. So it was a very significant cut. And a lot of people at the time said it was too deep and that we would never have to go that deep. I think it's probably true that we don't have to go that deep now, but it certainly wasn't a good, it certainly was an appropriate challenge. And I think because it was a very tough challenge, we learned more. So each project got a grant of 150,000, of which usually about 80 to 90,000 went on the building, and the rest went on the consultants, the contractors, overheads and profits and VAT, and a lot of monitoring, which I'll come to in a minute. About 1/3 of them hit the target, 17 kilograms of CO2 per square meter per year. The others did quite well in many cases. 1 or 2 did rather poorly. There was one house where the CO2 emissions went up, not down. Well, that was a bit of an anomaly. But a lot of them were very successful. And I think one of the real characteristics of this scheme was that because it was extensively monitored and analysed for a 2-year period after completion of the work, we learned about the things that went wrong as well as the things that went right. And in my view, we learned more from what went wrong than we did from what went right. And you don't often get that opportunity because very often people involved in projects that go wrong don't like to publicize them. They like to publicize the successes as case studies, but they don't like to publicize the failures. So this time we got access to the failures and it was all open book stuff. So we had 2 years of post-occupancy monitoring, 1 year of analysis by a technical panel, of which I was a member, and all the data from that work is still publicly available. In fact, if you Google Retrofit for the Future, you will find a TSB publication called Reducing Energy Use in Existing Homes, a guide to making retrofit work, which is the kind of considered deliberations of that panel a couple of years on from the end of the program. There was a lot of performance evaluation in Retrofit for the Future. As I said, 2 years of monitoring, and that was instrumented monitoring of fuel use, internal temperatures, relative humidities, carbon dioxide levels, mostly in those days with wireless sensors and online data concentrators and a degree of squirting the data elsewhere. But we weren't yet at that time in the era of Internet of Things devices, which we would almost certainly use now. So whereas most of these projects, the monitoring cost 25 or 30 or more thousand, I think we would do it very much more quickly and cheaply these days, and we'd probably bury some of the sensors in the schemes permanently, as we're beginning to do. We also did post-construction reviews of every project to see what was built and installed against what was originally designed and specified. These were 2-hour visits recorded in a standard format with photographs and notes. Of the 80-odd projects, 3 of us did all of them. So I did about 25 of those post-construction reviews, and they were some of the most informative visits I've had actually in my career in terms of figuring out or understanding what work can go wrong and what and why. So the 3 of us learned a lot. Perhaps we should have disseminated a bit more. And we also had post-occupancy assessments of every project. And that was 2 to 3 interviews of at least an hour each with every household, recorded in a standard format. They were carried out by data build, but I luckily managed to align my post-construction reviews with some of their post-occupancy assessments. So I was able to listen into the interviews, and putting the 2 together was itself quite useful. And so during the work of the panel, subsequently, we tried exactly to do that. And then there was a long period of quantitative statistical analysis of all the monitoring data and of qualitative assessment of what we think the lessons were, what we thought the lessons were by the panel. And the panel had a lot of people who had been involved in the project and quite a few independent people who hadn't. And I thought I'd share this graph because it was, for me, one of the earliest learnings from Retrofit for the Future. And it's slightly down a rabbit hole, but basically the left hand, the y-axis, shows the cost of the retrofit, and the x-axis shows the percentage CO2 reduction compared with the original emissions of CO2 that was achieved by each project. And each little blue dot is one of these Retrofit for Future projects. And the fitted curve, as you might expect, is a classic exponential cost effectiveness curve, which basically says to us, the more CO2 you want to save, the more you have to spend. And there has to be at some point a cost effectiveness balance point where you're spending a lot more on the right hand side of the graph to save a little bit more CO2, or at the other end of the graph you're spending money to not achieve very much, and you clearly want to be somewhere in the middle. And so that was an early lesson, and we've been teaching retrofit coordinators about that ever since. And the red line here is at £25,000, because over the years since, well, before and since Retrofit for the Future, quite a lot of us who've been doing a lot of retrofit have come to the view that an average cost of 25,000 is what you need to spend per dwelling to do a deep retrofit. Quite a lot more than Bays might be saying, and that lots of housing associations and some other people are saying. But I've done, I would say, several hundreds, if not into the thousands, of analyses of types of dwellings for housing associations. And every time we do one, I've always asked the analyst, what's the average cost of getting to that standard? And pretty much every time the average is between 23 and 27,000. So 25 is a good figure. It's a good one to work with. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we think it's less than that. And we're probably spending too much if it's more. But having said that, it's an average. And the spread around that average is very big. The cheapest retrofits are probably 15 grand, and the most expensive are probably 50 grand because of the complications of particular forms of dwellings. Now that green line then is your 25,000 per dwelling, which ends up with a national retrofit cost for the national retrofit program of 625 billion, which feels about right to me. It's not all government money, of course, it's from all of us one way or another by multiple routes, but that's approximately what we've got to spend over the next 30 years to do our retrofits. And then the green line is where the red line cuts the curve, and it rather amazingly comes out at pretty much exactly 60%. And that again shows that data from Retrofit Future 10 years ago bears out the conversations we've now been having a lot recently, particularly with Bays, about where the balance point is between on the left-hand side of the green line, retrofit to reduce demand, and on the right-hand side, decarbonizing the supply. I mean, the question senior Bays officials keep asking my UCL colleagues is it cheaper to spend money on more offshore wind or to do deep retrofit? And the answer is you have to do both. And there is a balance point, both for the stock and for any individual stock, and probably for every building, and they're all a bit different, but it's somewhere around 60% reduction in the unretrofitted emissions of the dwelling. So that became quite an important graph. We've used it in retrofit coordinator training many times since then. But going back to more general views about Retrofit for the Future, we learned a few key lessons. And one of them was that at that time, we weren't properly integrating the improvements into coherent overall packages, building fabric improvements, services improvements, and renewables. And we didn't have a kind of clear picture of the fabric first approach: reduce demand with the fabric, improve efficiency with the services, and then top up performance with the renewables, which is now embodied in our standards, of course. And when I say here poor integration, what I really meant was that we learned very quickly that where retrofit goes wrong is at the corners, junctions, edges, and interfaces. Corners, junctions, and edges are where one element meets another. A wall meets a roof meets a wall meets a floor, a wall meets a window, or whatever it might be. That's where the thermal bridging and the air tightness problems come from. And interfaces are about interfaces between the building fabric and the building services, making sure they're well coherent with each other, and also interfaces between the building services and the people. And picking up what Emily was saying earlier, I'd absolutely say that the people are a critical factor in this process. If we don't get the people on board, it's not worth doing any of the rest of it, really. So that led us to this maxim that retrofit goes wrong at the corners, junctions, edges, and interfaces, and that's where we ought to be spending our time concentrating on getting things right. But we also detected across the 100 and odd projects a comprehensive lack of understanding of ventilation, which subsequently I've found is comprehensive across the industry, really. For some reason in the UK, probably because we've lived with buildings ventilated by being leaky for quite a long time and only ever started to put ventilation into buildings in the 1970s, we don't really understand what ventilation is for in the way that, say, the Germans or the Italians or even the Americans do. So what we found in Retrofit for the Future was poor strategies for ventilation, poor specifications, very poor installation, very poor commissioning, and actually poor maintenance and operation as well. So everybody, right through to the users, was not really understanding what these ventilation systems were for and why they were being put in their homes. Of course, we know why we're doing it. It's to do with maintaining good air quality when we've reduced the infiltration rate and making sure we don't get condensation and mold. But we didn't really elucidate that really clearly at that time. Quite a lot of the projects in Retrofit the Future were delivered by teams who were coming out of the passive house stable. There were people with passive house experience. Some of the teams might dare to say were passive house zealots, but nevertheless, they brought a lot of that experience to it. But one of the things that those teams did was they defaulted the ventilation to mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, MVHR. And that was because they believed that to get to 17 kilograms of CO2 per square meter per year, you had to recover the ventilation losses. Actually, if you do 60%, as on my previous graph, you probably don't. But that was why we ended up with a lot of MVHR systems, which were actually, MVHR was designed to provide, it provides excellent air quality, good ventilation, but it's designed to do so in one-off new passive houses. It wasn't designed to go into Victorian terrace houses and 60s flats and 30s semis. So we had a lot of problem in Retrofit Future with systems that were not matched to the building fabric, or where the building fabric could not be improved to a good enough standard to work well with MVHR, and some which just did not fit. There was just so much ducting to go in to make the MVHR system work that we either had to put multiple bends in it, which increased the resistance and the noise and the fan power and everything else, or we had to, in some cases, in fact, in 2 cases, we were asked by the tenants to remove the MVHR systems because they wouldn't put up with the loss of space. So there were lots of big issues around ventilation, and we've spent a long time since trying to learn more about it. Then we learned, again, picking up some of Emily's points, that there were a lot of problems with poor commissioning, poor handover, and poor advice. And in the case of Retrofit Future, where these independent teams were often delivering these demonstration retrofits, the occupants weren't sufficiently engaged with the process, and should have been, and rather surprisingly the maintenance staff were. So we had at least 2 occasions of maintenance staff from the housing association coming along 6 months or a year after handover in response to complaints, and finding a piece of kit like a heat pump that they didn't understand, or an MVHR system, and saying, oh, we don't do those, and they just took them out. And in one case, they took out the MVHR system and left the house with no ventilation whatever. So another lesson was, everybody who's going to be involved in not just delivering the retrofit, but operating and maintaining it subsequently needs to be part of the team. And at the end of the process, Rick Holland from Innovate UK made this statement: retrofit is not rocket science, but it is complicated. It's not something that we can treat as simple. There are plenty of risks, both process risks and technical risks. Most of those risks are related to moisture in some way, and we need to figure out how to manage them. So we need to deal with this complexity. It's a bit like the same complexity that Emily was talking about from a slightly different point of view. So in trying to understand those risks, we then started to do analysis of what the risks are and where they are and how to manage them. This is a little diagram I stole from DEC at the time of the Green Deal. This was called the customer journey originally. You go from assessment to design to installation, and then you have your retrofit in operation. It was a bit glib, I thought, at the time. But I've put design in red with a question mark because actually there wasn't very much of that done subsequently in government-funded programs like the Green Deal and ECO. We went straight from assessment to installation in most cases, and nobody seemed to see the need for design. The assessor would choose the options for improvement, and they would just get installed the next week. And so we started to think about, well, where do the risks go in this process? Where do they appear? So if we start with assessment, I'm not going to go through all these, you can read them on the screen, but essentially we started to identify a set of risks that would occur if you didn't do the assessment well, and a set of mitigation activities which might start to soften that. So this is pure learning from Retrofit Future in many ways. And recently Colin King said to me, the quality of your assessment is reflected in the quality of your retrofit eventually. So that was a kind of real, that's a real summation of experience, I think, there. That's certainly true. If we go to design, there wasn't much of that in most publicly funded and promoted retrofit, but there was quite a lot of it in Retrofit for the Future. These are the design risks. Some of the things are the things I've already talked about. And these are the mitigation that we identified. And a lot of these points were put together by the Centre of Refurbishment Excellence, where at Core in Stoke-on-Trent, where David and I used to work together. And then in installation, risks to do with all these things, mitigation to do with these, and perhaps one that's worth pointing out is the one that David Adams tells a good story about. You know, Mrs. Smith has a retrofit, and she has 6 measures, so 6 installers turn up in 6 different vans on 6 different days, and she takes 6 days off work in order that they can all install their measures, and they never meet each other. And that's guaranteed to not deal with the corners, junctions, and edges. Whereas what we really want to be moving towards, and I think we slowly are, is multi-skilled teams. One van with 4 guys in it, or 4 people in it, turns up and installs all the measures working together. And that way, with a team leader and somebody responsible, that way we get a better job. So it was those kind of issues that became apparent. There are other points there which some of you will be familiar with already, I'm sure. And then finally, comes to operation. We don't have risks, we have consequences. These are the things that go wrong. These are certainly things that went wrong in Retrofit for the Future. And the mitigation is here. Things like handover procedures, post-retrofit testing and evaluation, and promoting appropriate behavior by the residents. So again, we learned at that stage a little bit about what we ought to be focusing on. And actually at Core, we produced this diagram, which looking back on, I'm surprised it survived, but basically here's the original design, the original process, but the suggestion was that we need to have some standard materials, products, details, and procedures that we can apply to our retrofit at scale. And we identified the need for a person who is a kind of retrofit project manager. That's what we originally called them. They later became retrofit coordinators, whose job is to manage these materials, products, details, and processes, understand how to deploy the right people, like assessors, and understand how to do risk-assessed inspection and monitoring and auditing at this end of the process in order to make sure we've got rapid feedback and quick fixes when things don't go well. If we're going to do our national program, we're going to be delivering 5 retrofits a minute. Then if something goes wrong with one of these, and we find out today, and it takes us 3.5 weeks to fix it, that's quite a lot of bad retrofit in the next 3.5 weeks at 5 a minute before we fix it right. So the word rapid on here is quite important. So that's not the process diagram we ended up with, but it was very informative along the way. But now I want to just take a little diversion into retrofit failures. While Retrofit the Future was happening, almost simultaneously, actually, DEC was specifying the Green Deal and specifying the first generation of eco in succession to EEC and Warmfront and so on, and starting to build big programs to try and alleviate fuel poverty and effectively do retrofit. And what was, I think, quite interesting looking back as a lesson is that what DEC did was they took out all the professionals. When we approached DEC to say, well, you need a retrofit project manager or a retrofit coordinator, and you need an architect or someone to do the designing, and you need some engineers and surveyors, DEC said, well, they're all too expensive, we can't afford that. And so they left those programs in the hands of installers, who in my view were not, and in many cases still are not, sufficiently knowledgeable about the technical aspects of retrofit, about risks, about moisture, and those kinds of things, and about building physics to be able to do a good job properly, especially when things go wrong. So we ended up with a whole series of failures. There was the Glasgow event in 2014 where 4 tons of EWI fell off the top 2 stories of a tower. There was in the same storm in Scotland, the next day, the outer leaf of an insulated gable wall of Oxgang School fell off. In both of those cases, nobody was hurt. Usually when things fall off buildings, they fall on to the head of the spouse of an American lawyer. But in both these cases, luckily, there were no injuries. In Preston, a little bit earlier in 2013, nearly 300 houses were effectively rendered uninhabitable by very poorly installed, non-designed, bodged external wall insulation funded by the CESP scheme. And what happened very quickly was that because the details were bodged, rain got behind the insulation very quickly and soaked into the brickwork and rendered the homes uninhabitable because there's nowhere for the water to go but to come out inside the dwellings in the form of damp and mold. And these were all owner-occupied homes. 66, I think, of them, no, 22, sorry, of them have been remediated by BEIS. The rest haven't yet been, but NEA now has a budget of between £4 and £6 million to put the rest of the houses right. And the poor people there, partly because of COVID, are still waiting for that remediation. So that was a classic failure. And it was one that drove the thing I'm going to talk about next, which is Each Home Counts. Then, of course, we had Grenfell Tower, which was clearly a retrofit failure. It was to do with the fire spreading behind the new insulated external cladding. Many of you have probably been following the inquiry reports each night now. It's quite a horrifying story, really. And
Peter, I'm really sorry, but because we started late, we're gonna need to move on.
Okay, I'll keep going.
People know the Each Home Counts bit, actually. If that's okay.
So Each Home Counts is next. Here we had an industry-led review as a response to those problems. Lots of recommendations and an implementation board that spent 2 years. Both Kate and I were on that board, bringing the 27 recommendations into place. And that led us to the BSI Retrofit Standards Framework, which is how we brought the lessons from Retrofit the Future into place. And the point of the Retrofit Standards Framework is that when Trustmark says that, well, when government or anyone else says that a retrofit program must be Trustmarked, to adopt the quality mark Trustmark, then Trustmark requires compliance with the new standard PAS 2035, and PAS 2035 requires compliance with lots of other standards in the framework, other BSs, other standards, and so on. So it's a mechanism for bringing all of the best practice that we had learned into play on every project, bringing it to bear. And this is PAS 2035. Do you want me to stop now, David?
I think so. Yes. No, sorry, Peter. I wish we had more time, but I'm very keen to ensure that all our speakers at least get to give their presentations.
There's one slide here, so let me spend 30 seconds on that, and then we'll
go on.
So over here in the gap, we have all those failures, and we have Retrofit the Future. That led us to Each Home Counts. That led us to impose the Trustmark quality mark. The Trustmark quality mark now has a compliance role to do with inspections and enforcements and remediation, and it has a data warehouse into which records of things are uploaded. Trustmark requires compliance with PAS 2035. PAS 2035 requires compliance with lots of other standards. PAS 2035 requires installation in accordance with PAS 2030 and the MCS standards, and all that information is uploaded. And all of the things in grey are part of what we call the BSI Retrofit Standards Framework. And I would say that is a direct product of the Retrofit Future programme.
Yeah.
There you go.
You're right. Thank you so much. So sorry to have interrupted you. What I'm going to ask you to do, Peter, if it's okay, there's been lots of questions put in the chat. And perhaps if you're able to multitask, perhaps you could respond to some of those in the chat. And any that don't get answered, we'll come back to in a panel discussion. But thank you very, very much. If you could unshare your screen, please.
Yeah.
We'll now move on to, I suppose, the future and the policymakers who are busy developing good policy that's going to support whole house retrofit involving local authorities and social landlords. So first up is Kate Duffy. Kate is the policy lead on the LAD scheme, but has for many years also been involved in the ECO programme and also the development of the PAS 2035 standard, which she'll never forget. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, David, and thank you for inviting me along. It's quite nice to get out of the policy making and actually listen to real life examples. So as you said today, I'm going to really take a narrow focus on what we're doing under the Local Authority Delivery Scheme, which I will call the LAD scheme from now on for ease, and then maybe look a little bit at the fuel poverty strategy. But I just did want to say, just following on from Peter there, you know, I'm taking a narrow view on my presentation, but I have worked through the Each Home Counts review and on ECO in the past. If you've got any questions relating to that, also happy to take questions on that. And I also work as the sponsor for the PAS standards. So we've had a lovely journey over the last couple of years on PAS 2035. So to kick off, I just wanted to introduce the Green Home Grants Local Authority Delivery Scheme. So I'm the policy lead on this, and you'll have heard about the Green Home Grant voucher scheme. So they're all under the same pot of money, but this is a very separate scheme and a very separate policy. So I'll just move along there if I can. Okay, so I'm not sure how much people know about the LAD scheme. It's very much been the quiet cousin of the voucher scheme. So I'm just going to start very high level, and then we can kind of go into a bit more detail. But this was announced as part of the Chancellor's kind of stimulus scheme back in July 2020, and a very quick turnaround to develop a large scheme and policy. So we normally take months to do business cases, design policy, test policy, consultations. For this one, it was a quick, let's get the money out. How are we going to do that to get some retrofit going and to support jobs that had been kind of lost or put on hold because of COVID? So we had 500 million put our way for local authority delivery scheme, with the aim of really focusing on low-income householders, helping them save money, cutting carbon, and creating more jobs as well. So that 500 million was split into two phases originally, with 200 million being allocated directly to local authorities. And we did this through a competition that was managed internally at BEIS. So we put out some guidance and an application form and said to local authorities, if you would like a cut of this funding, please apply directly to us. And then we assess those bids along 3 different lines. So they're assessed along deliverability, if could the money get spent, which is obviously really important for economic stimulus scheme. Around strategic fit, so does it fit the policy in terms of both identifying low-income households and also looking at the right buildings and the right measures, and also value for money, which is always one of our government drivers, isn't it? So following on that 200 million through phase 1, we then have phase 2, which is the remaining 300 million. And this is all being allocated directly to the 5 local energy hubs, so of the regions of England. And those local energy hubs have put together sourcing strategies and procurement frameworks to work with their local authorities to continue delivery, but through direct engagement with local energy hubs and not for a competition to BEIS. So that's the big difference between the 2 phases. As you will see here on this slide, we've got a bit of a busy summer coming up. So the first phase, originally meant to be 200 million, we put out a competition all the way back in October or even earlier than that. And unfortunately, due to kind of the time we had to get the money out the door and the delivery window, which originally was planned to end in March, we were undersubscribed massively. So we didn't get our 200 million out, and we've got about 74 million out in bids. And this kind of led to us having to run a second competition very rapidly to try and get the rest of the 200 million out. We were successful. And with our getting that out, so that's phase 1B, so 126 million across 81 projects. And what I think we were very aware in BEIS, having a lot of history working in energy efficiency projects, is that you shouldn't be doing mass delivery over a winter period. Things like Fishwick do happen. The Preston example that Peter was talking about. We shouldn't be putting EWI in the middle of winter in the rain and in the cold. So we managed to get ministers to agree. See that phase 1A now running through to June, and phase 1B will run on September. Phase 2 also will be starting from March. So you'll see March, April, May, June are really kind of a busy window, but we are kind of hoping that this will lead on to other policies in the future, which I'll come and talk to in a minute. So just a quick overview of the scheme rules. I don't want to go into too much technical detail, but these are the kind of things that local authorities have had to demonstrate to us with bids, or local authority have to talk to their regional energy hubs about. So the scheme is focused on all tenures. So we've got owner occupiers, rented sector, and social housing eligible within the scheme rules. But the households must be low income. And there's a various way of demonstrating if a household is low income. We tend to say if the whole household is 30k or less, that would be considered low income, or there are alternative methodologies. And part of that, we said that social housing can be seen as a proxy, as long as there's kind of supported by a bit of eligibility checking throughout as well. Recognise that the two tend to go hand in hand, so that's an easier way of. Peter will be very unhappy with the cost caps that we have in. So the cost caps for owner occupiers, so owner occupiers who are low income, receive up to £10,000 grant for their project on their home, and they don't have to contribute any money towards that. So they get this funded and their home is upgraded, zero contribution. We then have some different rules for rented properties. So private or social landlords can get £5,000 maximum subsidy scheme, and they have to contribute a third of the cost of the project. So I think most of you are getting owner-occupiers treated under the scheme. Contributions can be quite difficult, but we are now starting to see the more contribution schemes coming through as well. So we're looking at the worst homes. So we are focusing predominantly on E, F and G, although we have allowed some D-rated properties coming in phase 1B and phase 2. And that's more to focus on a kind of pepper potting. If there's a D in a block, we don't want that to stop delivery. So we still really want to be focused on E, F and G, but we realise for economies of scales and getting projects done that we need to allow band E's into that group as well. In terms of contractors, we try to stay as closely aligned to eco as possible, because we understand that the supply chain is likely to be the same as delivering under the energy company obligation. So we have said PAS standards must be used, recommended Trustmark, and everyone is working to Trustmark. So that's really good that the businesses are taking that up. And we are making for phase 2, although that starts before the end of the transition to PAS 2035, we are mandating that phase 2 funding schemes have to be delivered in accordance with PAS 2035. Unlike the voucher schemes, so the kind of sister programme, we have said that all measures are eligible that are energy efficiency for low carbon heating. No fossil fuels are allowed in, and we don't have any limits on having to have primary and secondary measures. So you don't have to necessarily have EWI to get your windows done. However, the way we assessed bids was on the value for money and strategic fit, as I said. So is any bids that had more than 50% of measures that weren't wall insulation or low carbon heating were scored down and were less likely to get funding. And in phase 1B, we were oversubscribed, so there were some projects that we weren't able to fund in that scheme. This is a very busy slide. I don't want to go through it, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things of the different rules going through. So most of the rules do stay the same. Slight differences on which bands are allowed in on EPC rated. So on phase 1A, we had said only E, F and G, and I've said on phase 1B and 2, we've opened that up. For the rest of the criteria, we've tried to keep exactly the same with the changes to the PAS standards as mentioned. But I'm happy for this to be sent round if that's useful afterwards. So what's the scheme actually delivering? We do get asked this on a daily basis and at PQ, so what's useful to have here. As I said, in phase 1A, we had 74 million going out, and that was for 55 different projects and over 100 local authorities. So we did have some consortium bids coming in for some of the bigger bids to have delivery across a wider area. So we're looking to deliver around 10,000 low-income homes under phase 1A. And then combining that up with the rest of the schemes, we're looking at the 126 million for 81 projects in phase 1B. So that's our 200 million. That's another 200 local authorities involved, although there are crossovers. So a lot of the local authorities that bid for phase 1A actually put in extended bids for 1B, so they could just get more households in their area. So it's not completely separate 200 local authorities, the original 100. So that 126 million would be looking to upgrade about 15,000 homes. And then on phase 2, as I said, we've got 300 million and we're looking to upgrade 30,000 homes on that scheme. So, these are quite chunky numbers in quite short timelines. Delivery has started. We have faced some problems with COVID. And as you can imagine, people weren't comfortable having tradesmen in their homes when it was very severe and the numbers were peaking during the winter. We've seen that easing up already, even with the lockdown being in place. So we're hoping delivery now will start to ramp up as we get out of the really bad winter months. I thought I might as well put in some pictures, just because I think that my slide was quite boring. So I just wanted to give a view of what is happening on regional delivery. And I've only included phase 1 here because the design of phase 2 using local energy hubs is trying to pick up LAs that don't normally engage. So there are quite a lot of usual suspects that already have resources in place to be able to quickly apply for BEIS funding. And that's more what phase 1 has been aimed at. But as you can see, across all of the phases, there is quite a big spread across the whole of England. And we are hoping that, like I said, all those grey bits we can pick up in phase 2 or in future funding. So I think David wanted me to do a little bit of future looking. So I've just pulled out a couple of things that I thought were interesting and might be of use for you guys on the fuel poverty standards. So the new sustainable warmth strategy, I think we've moved away from fuel poverty for some reason, was published on the 11th of February. And this is really designed at looking longer term on how we're going to get householders both to be out of fuel poverty, but also reach that net zero agenda and towards all of our targets. So the big 4 that we're looking at is getting worst first. So getting the absolute worst homes in terms of both low income, likelihood for fuel poverty, and the quality of the building. And so those F&Gs, really focusing on those. Again, driving cost effectiveness. We have to remember we're dealing with taxpayers' money. So as much as we would love to go and spend 30 grand to do everyone's houses up, it's not going to fly. And also we do have to think about there's a lot of houses that maybe aren't valued at more than say 80k or 100k. How much should we be spending to retrofit these kind of homes? So there's a lot of political questions around cost effectiveness, and that kind of links into why we have caps around the 10k rather than around what we would like to see around the 25k there. And then kind of the vulnerability and sustainability, which I hope we'd all see in a fuel poverty strategy. So I just put up a couple of things here. We've talked about LAD. We've also got ECO and HUG coming up, pumping some funding into green finance to prime the pump for private lenders, and also a lot going on with social housing. And I think we do have one of my colleagues talking about social housing here today as well. So lastly, but not least, what money is coming? So we have the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which has already awarded 62 million to 17 local authorities. We've got the Home Upgrade Grant of 150 million that's already been committed. And we're looking at this as being kind of a bridge to a larger scheme in the future, but obviously we need to test how this works. The Home Upgrade Grant is focused on low-income houses and will be off gas grid. So very targeted scheme to really get the worst homes there. The ECO scheme, Energy Company Obligation, we've committed to deliver that all the way out to 2026 and re-increasing funding from 640 million to 1 billion a year. So kind of ECO's gone for a bit of a full circle there. It started off as about 1.2 billion. It declined over time, and now we're kind of pumping more money into that again. And across the piece, underpinning all of our schemes, we are really focusing on moving to these new standards and lifting quality from the recommendations that came out of Each Home Counts. So we're moving all of our schemes to PAS 2035 led upgrades. So that's kind of everything I put together, but I'm happy to take any questions on the LAD scheme or wider policy.
Well, there are lots of questions for you, Kate, as you might expect.
Oh, is that? Okay.
They are in the chat. Now, just I hope you won't mind, but because out of politeness to the other speakers, I'd like to ensure they get their presentations in before the advertised finish time of 4 o'clock, because otherwise people will be leaving for other meetings. So we'll come back to those questions. If you want to answer any of them in the chat in the meantime, Kate, please do, but we will come back to them. So let's move on to the world specifically of social housing then. And we're going to look first at the whole house retrofit competition. I remember it being launched very well. That was a day where we used to be able to get together in a room and drink nice coffee and have croissants and things. 2018, I think it was launched. Who have we got? Adam, if you'd like to share your screen, brilliant. You're going to tell us about progress so far and what's been learned so far too.
Great. Yeah, I'll just put this into present mode. Can you see that okay?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Great, cool. So hi everyone, and yeah, thanks very much, David, for inviting me. And yeah, I'll just give this will just be a very sort of short run through of our whole house retrofit competition. I'm the program lead at BEIS for a series of our sort of innovation pilots. So one of them is our whole house retrofit scheme, but I also work on several others, including a green home finance competition that works to sort of work with lenders to mobilise private capital to sort of again address this sort of gap of funding and the need for retrofit there. But I'll just sort of give a whistle-stop tour of what's happened so far in whole house retrofit, and some of the learnings that have started coming through. And I'm very grateful for Emily for also touching on a couple of things which I'll just sort of emphasise as well. And she has a much more sort of, especially with the Nottingham project, has a much closer eye on what's coming out of the projects there. So just as a bit of context behind the whole house retrofit competition, it was actually launched in the summer of 2019. Feels like a long time ago, a pre-COVID competition, but there we go. And it's due now to complete in March 2022. There's been fairly significant delays with COVID, as you'd expect, but things are starting to happen, which is really exciting. In a nutshell, I think the rationale behind the whole house retrofit competition is really to serve as a key early step, I think, in demonstrating cost reduction in deep retrofitting of buildings through both the sort of economies of scale and through process innovations, recognising the relatively sort of nascent and emerging state of whole house retrofit solutions. That's to say, it's sort of explicitly an innovation competition, as sort of pilot to test out how and where cost reductions can be achieved and what lessons we need to learn to support and build on this approach to treat suitable homes, both in the sort of social housing stock and more broadly, and feed into sort of future policy and schemes, including the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and Demonstrator. So just to offer a quick summary for those who aren't necessarily familiar with the competition, with some of the objectives of the competition. So as I said, whole house retrofit is a competition interested in achieving cost reduction, and the objective set was a target of between 5 to 20% cost reduction of retrofit within the project lifetime. Projects are expected to take a fabric first approach, and the minimum number of dwellings that need to be retrofitted is set at 75 homes, with an energy performance target of between 30 and 50 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum where practicable. In terms of funding, the whole house retrofit competition forms part of BEIS's £505 million energy innovation portfolio. So of this pot of money, 90 million was targeted towards accelerating the deployment of technologies and solutions to reduce and decarbonise our buildings and tackle fuel poverty. And so 7.7 million was allocated to 3 projects in the whole house retrofit competition, and these are London Borough of Sutton, Nottingham City Council, and Cornwall Council. So we've got a mix of fabric and clean heat measures with almost 350 homes retrofitted across the 3 projects. So in terms of the current state of play, all 3 projects are sort of now shifting into actual retrofit delivery, which is really exciting to see, and the sort of learnings that are emerging and coming through, I think it could be really invaluable, both for this project sort of as it moves forward, but also in the demonstrating the sort of iterative learning of whole house retrofit, helping us sort of really capture some of the challenges and barriers, but also things that are working well, and help us build good practice there. So I think there's lots to say on a sort of project specific level, and I don't want to ventriloquize on projects' behalf, but what I've done for the next sort of 5 minutes, say, is just brought together an outline of 3 sort of main themes coming out on a program level, read, I guess, from BEIS's perspective, from our sort of project management perspective, and how we can help support projects sort of going forward. So these themes are tenant engagement, supply chain capabilities, and remedial enabling works. And in many ways, these sort of overlap with what Emily was saying and what previous speakers were as well. Great. So to provide a bit of summary on this first point then, tenant engagement, I think, as Emily also said earlier, all projects have been really clear on the importance of placing tenants' needs at the centre of this work, with the ultimate aim of minimising the disruption and intervention time in tenants' homes. So several different approaches across the 3 projects, but all have ensured that they have a resident liaison officer on board to improve that customer journey and really build a sort of personal relationship with residents as a point of contact. And I think the key sort of lesson here is that even though it's a relatively resource-heavy activity, it really is essential to have that commitment and buy-in from residents, which ultimately has a potential kind of cost-saving and time-saving benefit, not least in sort of minimising the risk of bespoke measures like EWI being measured for a specific house and then a resident pulling out and things like that. So part of this, I think, projects reporting is recognising the different needs that tenants have, especially vulnerable tenants and those with particular sort of mental or physical needs, and understanding when an intervention is most appropriate. So building on existing tenant data has been, I think, a really important source of information there. And I guess worth just contextualising this and saying that though COVID, I think, has brought to the fore lots of these issues and sort of anxieties from tenants, actually these aren't sort of COVID specific worries, and the high level of work implied by whole house retrofit taken in mind, I think we need to work collectively. The sort of challenge here is sort of building confidence and supporting tenants through this retrofit journey. Also, just wanted to point out this nice picture, which is of the pilot property in the Nottingham City Council project, which is now completed and looks very smart. So the second theme, supply chains. There's a sort of overlapping point, I think, with tenant engagement. It probably won't come as a surprise, as I said, that COVID has impacted on the sort of initial delivery of retrofits in this competition. But I think one of the benefits, or at least a sort of silver lining in the sort of looming cloud of COVID, is that it's enabled local authorities and projects to work with contractors quite closely, I think, to ensure that there's a really clear work and sequencing of work in place prior to work commencing. So ensuring this work happens in a much more efficient way, which part of the property a contractor will be working on, or what tools and materials they need on a particular day. So in a way, this is obviously a sort of fairly obvious point, but whole house retrofit is complicated. It's relatively new, and especially built on process innovations. I think the need for a clear scheme of works is all the more important, not only for the sort of potential cost-saving benefits through sort of streamlining and sequencing of works, but projects are also using this as a sort of central plank in the tenant engagement proposition, providing really good disclosure to residents about what is being done and when. So it's really clear for the residents side of things as well. Also on the supply chain theme, I think another emerging learning is around the need for really agile response in sort of design and delivery of whole house retrofit. And one of the benefits projects have highlighted is working with sort of really agile SME consortia or multi-skilled contractors, enabling a sort of more integrated process to whole house retrofit through the pooling of capabilities and ultimately shortening that sort of on-site time for residents. And then the third point, whistling through, is around remedial and enabling works. And I think all 3 projects have highlighted greater than initially anticipated levels of remedial works. I think in part because these projects are working with some of the worst performing properties that ultimately would benefit most from a whole house retrofit approach. I think the key learning that's really sort of starting to come through from projects is a developing understanding of selection criteria of properties based on economic feasibility. And on a sort of related note, most projects have also highlighted that they found some residents have adaptations onto their properties, lean-tos and and porches that has a sort of knock-on impact on sort of the standardized design models that projects are exploring. So in response to all of this, the projects are working on developing spec sheets, and this is something we're really interested in tracking to improve that process of site investigation and capturing and collating known weaknesses and challenges associated with specific archetypes, ultimately helping to mitigate and reduce that sort of unforeseen issues and remedial works in the middle of projects. Also sort of associated with this, the importance of working with people who are incredibly familiar with those specific property types and those weaknesses and challenges associated with those archetypes. As a very final point, because David asked me to just touch on it, learnings around cost reductions from projects. Now, I think unfortunately it's a tiny bit too early to report on real kind of real cost savings coming from the project, as capital works have only really started in the past sort of couple of months. I think we also need to acknowledge a slightly more volatile situation at the moment, not least with COVID and Brexit as well. But as Emily said, I think there's lots of really exciting procurement activities and innovation partnership approaches that I think we'll be looking to aggregate demand on the whole house retrofit side of things, and I'm sure we'll have exciting news to report on that front in a few months' time. Two other more specific points to do with specific measures being installed. So one project has reported sort of costs around off-site wraparound solutions still remaining relatively high, and they're exploring solutions for sort of cavity wall homes. And they're quite excited about the sort of a range of different options, including continuous cavity fill, with the cost reduction implications of a fairly significant reduction, more in the region of the 40-50k whole house retrofit rather than the 60 or 70k baseline that they're working from. The other point raised so far is around MVHR, and slightly again links to this point of tenant engagement. Interesting to hear Peter on that earlier as well. So feedback from residents is that they just don't want the sort of space taken up in their homes through sort of ducting or energy inputs and things like that. So yeah, one of the projects is working on alternative sort of solutions and putting ducting through the sort of first floor void. So that has a sort of obvious knock-on cost implication. I'll stop there and realise that was a sort of very quick overview and a bit of a whistle-stop tour of this, the whole house retrofit competition. I'll pass over to maybe Mike now, who can provide us a bit more information on the main fund, if Mike's there.
That'd be great. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just putting this on the screen. Not sure whether you can see my screen yet.
Sorry, Mike, we're not getting that.
Just waiting.
Very sorry, Mike, but I'm not hearing you. I'm
Right.
Broadband connection okay. That's a bit better.
Let me just try again. Yeah, I'm speaking, so you can't hear me at all. Hello?
We can hear you, but it's very sort of digitally. Let's see how we go.
Yeah.
Let's see how we go, and I'll let you know if there is a problem.
I'm having difficulty seeing my screen. Just
Yeah, we're not seeing in PowerPoint, I'm afraid.
no. Okay.
Okay, so it should be as fairly straightforward. I know these things never are.
It's not working. No. Yeah, I'm having difficulty showing. Okay. It's not working from this end, I'm afraid. Yeah,
Mike, yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to overcome that, because we can barely hear you and we can't see the presentation. Mike, what we'll do, if it's okay with you, you and I will record a one-to-one session with you with the presentation, and then we'll share it with everybody.
That's fine.
I'm very sorry that it's come to that, but I don't think it's viable with this connection.
Okay, brilliant.
I will be in touch with you shortly after the event to arrange that. If I could, I'm very sorry, Mike. If I could invite all the speakers to unmute themselves and turn their microphones on. We've had lots and lots of good debate in the chat here. It's such a shame we haven't been able to hear there at the end about the plan for social housing decarbonisation fund, because there's real optimism, reasons to be optimistic about that, and scale about it, and it's embracing whole house retrofit concepts from the very outset. Mike, we can see you now. Just try that audio for me again. No.
Sorry.
No, it's really nothing you or I can do about it, I'm afraid. It's just one of those days. Perhaps we might be, I don't know if Adam is able to perhaps say anything about the SHDF scheme, just in terms of timescales and likelihood of this sort of long-rumoured £4 billion or so becoming available, and how it might be made available. Are you able to do that, Adam? You're muted at the moment.
I guess the sort of short answer is not especially, but I can maybe try and I don't want to sort of Mike can always put in the chat or kind of completely correct me if I got it wrong, but yeah, so a big amount of money, and how that is going to be spent over 10 years, I guess, is the real question. So as you'll be aware, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund demonstrator is a well, it was a 50 million, now it's a little bit more than that, pot of money to kind of get things going. Then there's going to be, the plan is, I think, to have it in 3 phases, so that at least that way, getting government to commit to a sort of 4 billion over 10 years is quite a difficult ask, but breaking that down makes things a little bit more realistic, I think. So as far as I can tell, and correct me, Mike, if I'm wrong, but it's going to be about £1 billion over 3-year increments, yeah, I can't say too much more about what that looks like, because it's just a slightly different team, I'm afraid. But if Mike is able to put something in the chat, I don't know if that's one way of getting on the sort of technological issue.
We will record Mike.
Sorry, I wouldn't want to kind of promise massive amounts of money and then it not going your way.
No, it's we're just putting you on the spot a bit there unfairly. We will record Mike's presentation and we'll share it separately with all delegates. But yes, I mean, I think it's well known that there was a Conservative Party manifesto commitment to an investment of £4 billion plus in social housing. Initially over a decade, I believe, but actually the thinking now is that we want to bring that forward and accelerate it off the back of these demonstrator projects and invest in good, viable and large-scale retrofit in social housing, which is very welcome news. Okay, so if I could ask all the panelists to unmute themselves. We have 10 minutes or so now before the scheduled finish time, and we'll try and get into a bit of a debate. So there's been lots of questions. I'm not going to address the park homes one now. That's been a sort of running battle, that one, over the last few weeks. But I suppose a question to the policymakers, summarising some of the questions a little bit. Do you think that we're now making better policy around retrofit? And do you think that perhaps there's been big learnings around what successful policy for retrofit might look like over the last few years? Put that one to Kate first, if I may.
I knew you were going to come to me with that one, David. I would say that we have a deeper understanding, and I think I worked on eco when it was first introduced, and I think that was the first time we had a PAS standard So before that, it had all been on building regs. So, you know, there has been kind of development over the last, 13 years or 7 years time. What I would say is the most recent package. So let's take away the 10-point plan and the really, you know, those kind of projects, but the stimulus packages we've had to deliver very, very quickly. So they probably aren't ideal. I don't think that we necessarily had enough time to properly test policy in the way that we do for eco. So kind of hands up, I don't think that we developed those in a way that we would ideally do. Saying that, what it has allowed us to do is start pumping money into the industry whilst we plan the longer term schemes. And I think it's really important for the narrative to get out there that, you know, we're not just doing this year funding. We will be funding, we have big targets to hit all the way through to 2050. So there will be big schemes coming. We are working on those with a more kind of longer term look rather than the what can we get to support industry under COVID, which is super important. But we know industry, if they're going to get trained up past 35, if they're going to plan their pipeline of work, they need to know that funding's coming and what that's going to look like. So we are working on that in the background as well.
Now, I understand, Kate, that your current Secretary of State has a brain the size of a planet. So presumably he's more than capable of getting his head around the sort of concepts we've talked about today. But how do we get politicians in general out of this sort of cycle of, you know, sudden injections of large amounts of money that then mysteriously disappear? I won't put that one to you, Kate, that's not fair. But how can we as a sector, how can we encourage politicians to take that more long-term view? Who would like to take that one? I'm going to try Emily.
Answer from a policy perspective on that one, and then I imagine Peter probably wants to say something as well. But what I've seen, and I've, you know, like I said, I've worked in the sector quite a while now, is there has been a change in attitude. You know, we think about things like getting the green crack off bills. I mean, we've come a long way in quite a short time in the way that this is treated. And especially in Bays, it is seen as one of the kind of pillars of kind of building the economy back. So I do think there has been a change. Absolutely not saying that we can't get better, but I would say keep going to your local MPs, keep saying to your local authorities, bid for this money, because if we can prove in schemes like LAD and ECO and the Social Housing Fund that we can get the money spent and we can do good jobs, then more money. And I think if we're not able to deliver on these shorter schemes, you know, there's risk that there won't be any future funding. So I think the message back is, yes, keep doing what you're doing to try and get politicians engaged, but what the politicians want to see is that industry can spend the money to a high quality. So if you can do that, there'll be more funding.
Okay, fantastic. Any other thoughts on that from the panel?
Can I just, I guess I'd like to just come in on that as well. And I think that's, I really do see that things seem to be a bit different. And there's some really positive movement, and the discussion about having this large amount of funding in a 10-year programme is so positive, but it is essential.
Oh, what recently?
To deliver.
Oh.
I think the fact that there are people writing in the chat about being so busy and not being able to recruit people. You know, I think it's so circular, and I think there's, you know, we really want to deliver and we want to prove that we can, and we can see the trajectory of how we can deliver as long as we know that there's an opportunity to carry on with the programme. So I think that would be my return ask, I think, from us, Kate, to you, is that yes, we will deliver, but we need to see that there's an opportunity to carry on delivering.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, we do raise that up the chain, both at the, you know, officials to ministers, but also from Bays to Treasury. And what's been very unfortunate in the last couple of years is we had 1 year spending reviews. So we cannot plan policy beyond the spending review that we get from Treasury. So we are fighting that battle. So I guess what I want to say is you've been heard and we are trying. So we'll see how we get on with that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone doubts the commitment of the officials, Kate, at all. Okay, Peter, did you have any thoughts on that point?
Well, I was just thinking that, you know, I very much support what Kate was saying. I deal with lots of different officials at Bays about retrofit almost on a daily basis. And I think that the level of expertise, understanding and commitment in the team there is huge. And you know, it's really gone forward. The problem is that the relationship between Bays and Number 10 in the Treasury. And I think the current issues with the greenhouse grant scheme, which we probably don't want to go there, but it is to do with the fact that number 10 in the Treasury designed it, and it was conceived by politicians who think that throwing lots of money at retrofit is a good way. It's a simple thing. It's a simple thing you can throw lots of money at and create lots of jobs, and that clearly isn't the case from all we've learned. So Kate made a point to me not long ago about how every now and then there are new ministers and they're younger and inexperienced and they don't know the backstory. And I think we have to help the team at Bayes with all that stuff as much as we can, because they're on our side. But the problem is persuading ministers and the Treasury what they need to do. And the point that somebody made about consistency is absolutely the top of my list. I don't think even 10-year programs is good enough. I think we need some really long-term commitments, which of course in a democracy with 5-year elections is hard to do. But what we need to do is encourage people to invest. We need to send the message to the people, to the owners, the occupants, the residents, that this is going to happen and why they need to do it. And we need to encourage companies that are going to help us do it to invest in training and equipment and skills and new business ventures. All of that needs consistency, and the sort of stop-start we've had for the last 10 years. I recently made a table of all the government retrofit programs since 2000, and I went off the page, and there were so many of them. And I'm talking about 30, several of which failed. So I'm completely with Kate. We need to get some consistency into this process, and if we can build in some long-termism, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's been lots of comments in the chat about funding levels and various schemes not having quite enough money to do what is really required. I think the £10,000 on lads is, and I will mention the park home thing here, it's clearly not enough to treat insulation of park home as one measure. But there are lots of other examples as well. I suppose it calls into question whether there needs to be more dialogue between government and the people who make that policy and those who perhaps know the detail of these costs, and whether there can be a bit of fine-tuning to things. I'm not sure who's best placed to answer that. Perhaps Adam from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, or from your project. Do you think you get enough input from industry?
So yeah, I mean, I don't know how much whether Kate might be better placed to kind of comment on this, but I think there's really exciting work that is coming out of the demonstrator and the whole house retrofit competition, not least in things like the innovation partnership and procurement approach and those sorts of things that does give a clear signal to the supply chain that there is something that longer term is a bigger prize, rather than sort of shorter term sort of short quick wins, whatever. So I think that in itself is a really promising picture of sort of demand aggregation and things like that. In terms of, I guess, the broader social housing decarbonisation fund, already, I think Martin put in the chat as well, there's the first wave of that beyond the demonstrator is another £60 million, I think, in the first spending review pledge, and I think that was already committed. I think that's a commitment, and then sort of future waves coming in 3-year chunks. So in terms of, I guess, longer term or slightly strategic thinking, hopefully these sorts of signals in specifically the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund are positive things. But I wonder if, I could sort of pass to whether Kate or I don't know whether Mike can chip in on either of those points.
From me, so.
I don't know I can be heard yet. So.
I'm afraid not. You still sound a bit like Davros, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry, Mike. Okay, well, look, I think we need to bring things to a close because that was the scheduled finish time. People will have other meetings to go to. So one final apology for the inconvenience you experienced at the beginning. I hope it hasn't messed you around too much. I'd like to thank all the speakers and commiserate with Mike. It's a bit of a wait, but we're going to organise that one-to-one filming, Mike, as soon as we possibly can, and we will make that available. The video of this session will be made available via the Retrofit Academy before the end of the week. We'll be sharing that with all and sundry on our YouTube channel, and you'll get a notification about that, and we'll let you know what we're doing about my presentation there. Thank you very much to our speakers, who are great as always. I've already asked Emily if we can publish her book, because I think we need her retrofit memoirs, and some cloning. So thank you very much to all of you. Next up from the Retrofit Academy is actually tomorrow. For those of you who are Centre of Excellence members, we have our PAS Club, which is where we literally get together for an hour and answer all questions relating to PAS 2035. So that's tomorrow lunchtime. You can register for it via Eventbrite, but you'll have had an email from Andy about it too. Any questions too with the centre, Andy is your man. Andy@retrofitacademy.org. Please get in touch, and we'll be in touch with follow-ups from this event. Thanks so much to everybody, and goodbye.